When you hear the word cartel, what comes to mind? You probably picture tattooed gangsters in the jungles of Colombia, underground tunnels in Mexico, or bags of cash buried in the desert. You think of violence, lawlessness, and men like Pablo Escobar or El Chapo. But the history is written by the victors, and the victors are very good at hiding their crimes. The truth is, the largest, most sophisticated and destructive drug trafficking operation the world has ever seen didn't speak Spanish. It spoke the king's English. It didn't operate in the shadows. It operated under the royal flag, with the full backing of the British Parliament and the Royal Navy. We are taught in school that the Opium Wars were about free trade. We are told it was a clash of cultures, a diplomatic misunderstanding that got out of hand. But that is a lie. The Opium Wars were about one thing and one thing only: a state-sponsored drug ring designed to balance a checkbook. This is the story of how the British Empire, the supposed beacon of civilization, deliberately turned millions of people into addicts to save its own economy. And it all started with a cup of tea. To understand how this happened, we have to look at the global economy of the 18th century. Today, we think of the West as the center of economic power, but for most of human history, the economic center of gravity was in the East, China, the Middle Kingdom. By the late 1700s, Britain had a problem, a very expensive problem. The British public had developed an insatiable addiction of their own: tea. What started as a luxury for the aristocracy had become a daily necessity from the factory worker to the queen. Britain was consuming millions of pounds of tea each year. But tea only grew in China, and the emperors of the Qing dynasty had zero interest in what Britain had to sell. British merchants tried to offer wool. The Chinese said no. They tried to offer cotton. The Chinese said no. They tried to offer clocks and scientific instruments. The Emperor Qianlong famously wrote to King George III, declaring that China possesses all things in abundance and has no need for foreign manufactures. This was a disaster for the British East India Company. The Chinese demanded payment in only one thing: silver. Massive amounts of silver. Year after year, ships left London loaded with silver bullion and returned with tea, silk, and porcelain. The trade deficit was bleeding the British Empire dry. The treasury was emptying. The currency was threatened. The East India Company, which was essentially a corporate government ruling over India, was facing bankruptcy. They needed a product that the Chinese didn't just want, but needed. They needed a product that would hook the customer and ensure repeat business forever.
They found it in the poppy fields of their new colony in India: opium. Opium had existed in China for centuries, used strictly as medicine. But the British discovered that if you processed it differently, if you mixed it with tobacco and smoked it, it wasn't just medicine anymore. It was a lifestyle, and it was highly addictive. The East India Company hatched a plan that was as brilliant as it was evil. They would use their control over India to monopolize the production of high-grade opium. They would process it in factories in Patna and Benares, pack it into wooden chests, and ship it to the coast of China. But there was a catch. Opium was illegal in China. The Qing emperor had banned it precisely because he knew it was poison. So the British government couldn't sell it directly without technically declaring war or looking like criminals. So they created a loophole. The East India Company would sell the opium at auction in Calcutta to private country traders. These were independent smugglers, but everyone knew who they were working for. These smugglers would sail to the Pearl River Delta in southern China, anchor their ships off the coast of Linton Island, and offload the drugs into small, fast boats called scrambling dragons, run by corrupt local Chinese gangs. The silver that the Chinese smugglers paid for the drugs would then be handed back to the East India Company in exchange for bills of credit. The company would then use that silver to buy tea in Canton to ship back to London. It was a perfect circle of money laundering. The tea drinkers in London got their brew, the government got their tax revenue, the East India Company got their profit, and the Chinese people got the addiction. At first, the trade was small, a few thousand chests a year. But the genius of selling an addictive substance is that the market grows itself. By the 1830s, the British were pouring over 30,000 chests of opium into China every single year. That is roughly 4 million pounds of concentrated narcotics. The effect on Chinese society was catastrophic. We have records from the time describing entire villages falling into ruin. Soldiers were too high to hold their muskets. Government officials were smoking in their offices instead of working. The flow of silver reversed. Instead of silver flowing into China, it was now pouring out at an alarming rate to pay for the black mud. The Chinese economy began to collapse. The Daoguang Emperor saw his empire crumbling. He had to act. He had two choices: legalize it and tax it, or wipe it out completely. There were voices in his court arguing for legalization, saying the war on drugs was impossible to win. But the emperor looked at the moral cost. He looked at his own son, who had reportedly dabbled with the drug, and he decided to fight. In 1839, he appointed a man named Lin Zexu as the imperial commissioner. Lin was a rare figure in a corrupt system. He was intelligent, incorruptible, and fiercely patriotic. He was given a simple order: go to Canton, the only port where foreigners were allowed to trade, and cut off the flow of opium forever. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton like a storm. He didn't just arrest the local Chinese dealers, he went after the source. He surrounded the foreign factory district where the British merchants lived. He cut off their food supplies. He withdrew their Chinese servants, and he issued an ultimatum: hand over every ounce of opium you have, or you will not leave. The British merchants were outraged. They were the masters of the seas. They were gentlemen of the empire. How dare this Chinese official treat them like common criminals? But they were starving, and they were surrounded. The British Superintendent of Trade, a man named Charles Elliot, had no choice. He ordered the merchants to surrender their stock, promising that the British government would reimburse them. Over the next few days, 20,000 chests of opium were hauled out of the warehouses. Lin Zexu didn't sell it. He didn't keep it. He dug massive trenches on the beach at Human. He mixed the opium with lime and salt water, waiting for the chemical reaction to destroy the drug, and then flushed it out to sea. He publicly apologized to the spirit of the sea for polluting it with such filth. It was the 19th century equivalent of a billion-dollar drug bust. It was a triumph of moral courage. But Lin Zexu had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was dealing with merchants. He didn't realize he was messing with the bank account of the most powerful military force on Earth. When news reached London, the reaction wasn't shame, it was fury. Not because they denied dealing drugs, but because China had dared to destroy British property. The lobbyists for the drug trade went to Parliament. They didn't talk about addiction, they talked about national honor. They talked about the arrogance of the Chinese. They argued that if China could confiscate British property at will, then no trade was safe. There was a fierce debate in Parliament. A young William Gladstone, who would later become Prime Minister, stood up and gave a speech that should have echoed through history.
He said, "A war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace, I do not know and have not read of." He called out the flag being used to protect an infamous contraband traffic. But morality doesn't pay the bills. The vote was cast. By a margin of just 9 votes, the British Parliament approved the war. They dispatched the Royal Navy.
In June 1840, the British fleet arrived off the coast of China. But this was not an invasion force the Chinese were prepared for. For thousands of years, warfare in the East had followed certain rules, but the British brought something new. They brought the Industrial Revolution. Among the wooden sailing ships was a monster unlike anything the world had ever seen, the Nemesis. It was the first British ocean-going iron warship. It was powered by steam, armed with heavy swivel guns, and it didn't care about the wind. While Chinese war junks relied on the breeze and the tide, the Nemesis could sail directly against the current, right up the shallow rivers, deep into the heart of the country. To the Chinese defenders, it must have looked like a demon, a ship made of metal that breathed black smoke and moved without sails. The clash that followed wasn't a war, it was a slaughter. The Chinese military was still using matchlock muskets, bows, and arrows. Their cannons were fixed in place, cemented into stone forts that couldn't aim. The British ships simply sailed past the firing angles and unleashed a barrage of explosive shells. We have accounts of Chinese admirals who fought with incredible bravery. They stood on the decks of their burning wooden ships, demanding to go down with the vessel. But bravery is no match for modern ballistics. In one battle, a single British steamship destroyed 15 Chinese war junks in a matter of minutes. The British casualties were often 0. The Chinese casualties were in the thousands. But the British didn't just want to kill soldiers, they wanted to strangle the economy. They knew they couldn't conquer all of China, it was too big, so they went for the throat. They sailed up the Yangtze River and blockaded the Grand Canal. This was the lifeline of the empire, the artery that carried grain from the fertile south to feed the capital in Beijing. When the grain barges stopped, panic set in. The emperor in Beijing, who had previously dismissed the British as barbarians, suddenly realized that his mandate of heaven was hanging by a thread. If the capital starved, the dynasty would fall. He had no choice. He sued for peace. In 1842, on the deck of the HMS Cornwallis anchored in the Yangtze River, the Chinese officials signed the Treaty of Nanking. History calls it the first of the unequal treaties, but looking back, it reads less like a treaty and more like a ransom note demanded by a criminal organization. First, China had to open 5 new ports for foreign trade, including Shanghai. Second, China had to cede the island of Hong Kong to the British Queen in perpetuity. That barren rock would become the headquarters of the drug trade for the next century. Third, and most humiliating of all, was the indemnity. The British forced the Chinese government to pay 21 million silver dollars. They had to pay for the cost of the war that was used to kill their own people. But the kicker? Included in that 21 million was $6 million specifically to compensate the British merchants for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed. Think about that logic for a second. Imagine the police raid a drug cartel today, seize the cocaine, and destroy it.
Then the cartel sues the government, wins, and forces the taxpayers to pay them the full street value of the drugs the police destroyed. That is exactly what happened in 1842. The British Empire had effectively legalized international drug trafficking at the barrel of a gun. You would think that would be enough, but greed is a bottomless pit. The First Opium War cracked the door open, but the British wanted to kick it off the hinges. They weren't satisfied. They wanted to sell opium legally everywhere, deep inside China. They wanted embassies in Beijing. They wanted the right for their citizens to travel freely and be immune to Chinese laws. So in 1856, they found a flimsy excuse to start the Second Opium War. This time, the French joined in, eager for a slice of the pie. If the First War was a tragedy, the Second was a desecration. The Anglo-French forces marched on Beijing, the emperor fled, and then an act occurred that still leaves a scar on the Chinese psyche today. Lord Elgin, the British High Commissioner, ordered the destruction of the old summer palace, the Yuanming Yuan. This wasn't a military target, it was a wonder of the world. It was a complex of palaces, temples, and gardens filled with priceless art, literature, and history spanning centuries. It was the Versailles of the East.
For 3 days, 3,500 British troops looted and burned it. The smoke was so thick it eclipsed the sun over Beijing. They smashed porcelain they couldn't carry. They fed ancient manuscripts to the fires. It was an act of cultural vandalism so profound that even Victor Hugo, the great French writer, wrote a letter condemning his own country's actions. He called them two bandits entering a cathedral. When the smoke cleared, the Chinese signed the Convention of Peking in 1860. The terms were absolute. Opium was fully legalized. The drug flooded the country. Christian missionaries were allowed to spread the gospel in the same provinces where British merchants spread addiction. By the late 19th century, it is estimated that 10% of the Chinese population was addicted to opium. That's over 40 million people. The entire social fabric of the country unraveled. Productivity collapsed. The government was broke. The Qing dynasty, once the wealthiest power on earth, became a hollow shell carved up by foreign powers. Historians in China call this the century of humiliation. It is a period of shame that shapes their national identity to this day. But for the British Empire, it was the Golden Age. The tax revenue from the opium trade became a pillar of the Indian economy. It funded the Royal Navy. It built the beautiful Victorian buildings in London and Bombay. The tea you drink, the porcelain in your grandmother's cabinet, the silver in the Bank of England, much of it was paid for by the slow, smoky death of millions of Chinese peasants. But here is the darkest irony of all. The British public, sitting in their parlors in London, largely believed they were doing God's work. They were told they were bringing free trade and civilization to a backward nation. They justified the drug trade by saying, if we don't sell it to them, someone else will. Does that argument sound familiar? It should, because while the uniforms change and the commodities change, the logic remains. The British Empire eventually faded, as all empires do. But the scar it left on China never healed. The century of humiliation didn't end until the chaotic mid-20th century. When the modern Chinese state was founded, it was built on a single unifying vow: never again.
Never again will we be weak. Never again will we let foreigners dictate our laws. Never again will we let gunboats sail up our rivers. If you want to understand modern geopolitics, why Beijing is so aggressive about its borders, why they built the world's largest navy, why they are obsessed with national sovereignty, you don't look at Karl Marx, you look at the Treaty of Nanking. They remember that when they were weak, the West didn't bring democracy, it brought drugs and destruction. But history has a terrifying sense of humor. It doesn't just move in a straight line, it moves in circles, and sometimes the pendulum swings back with a vengeance. Fast forward to the 21st century. Today, there is a new superpower. It is the wealthiest nation on earth. It has the strongest military. It considers itself the beacon of civilization, the United States of America. But look closer at the streets of Kensington in Philadelphia or the Tenderloin District in San Francisco. You will see something that looks hauntingly familiar to the opium dens of 19th century Canton. Zombies on the street, entire communities hollowed out, a workforce dropping out of the economy, a death toll that defies imagination. Over 100,000 Americans are dying every single year from overdoses. That is more than the Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan wars combined. And what is the agent of this destruction? Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin. And here is where the history book mirrors reality so perfectly it sends shivers down your spine. Where do the precursors, the chemical ingredients to make this poison, come from? According to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the vast majority of these chemicals originate in China. They are manufactured in massive industrial labs, shipped across the ocean, not in wooden chests this time, but in shipping containers, to Mexico, where cartels finish the product and flood the American border. The roles have perfectly reversed.
In 1840, the West was the industrial producer, and the East was the addict. The West demanded silver, and the East bled out. In 2024, the East is the industrial supplier, and the West is the addict. The East demands dollars, and the West is bleeding out. The diplomatic arguments are almost a word-for-word replay of the past. Today, American diplomats fly to Beijing. They plead with the Chinese government to crack down on the chemical labs. They say, "This is killing our people. You have a moral duty to stop it." And what is the response? For years, officials in Beijing have used the exact same logic the British used on them. They say, fentanyl is not the problem, demand is the problem. They say, this is an American social crisis caused by your own pharmaceutical companies and your own culture. Fix your own house before you blame the supplier. It is the ghost of Lord Palmerston speaking through modern diplomats. It is the free trade argument turned against its creator. Some geopolitical analysts have even whispered the term, the reverse Opium War. Is it a deliberate state-sponsored revenge plot, like the British East India Company? Or is it simply the cold, unfeeling hand of the free market finding a weakness in a decaying empire? Perhaps it doesn't matter. The result is the same. A nation that cannot control its borders or its addictions is a nation that is losing its future. The story of the Opium Wars teaches us a brutal lesson about the nature of power. Morality is a luxury of the strong. When an empire is rising, it will use any weapon, gunpowder, economics, or chemistry to expand. And when an empire is falling, it rarely dies from an invasion, it dies from the inside out, lost in a stupor, while its wealth flows away to a rising rival.
The British Empire destroyed the world to stop a train, maybe, but they also destroyed a civilization to sell a plant. And now, as we watch the news, we have to ask ourselves, are we reading a new chapter of history, or are we just reading the old one, written in a different language? History is a wheel, and it is crushing us right now. I'm the Economic Front. This channel explores the dark corners of history that school books ignore. If you want to understand the wars of tomorrow, you have to understand the crimes of yesterday. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next history lesson might be too late.